On the morning of August 12, 2000, at 7:28:27 Greenwich Mean Time, seismic monitoring stations across Norway, Canada, and Alaska registered an event in the Barents Sea. The signature measured 1.5 on the Richter scale. 135 seconds later, at 7:30:42 GMT, the same stations recorded a second event from the identical location. This signature measured 3.5 on the Richter scale, substantially more powerful than the first. The Norwegian Seismic Array at Kjeller, operating continuously since the Cold War to monitor nuclear testing, provided precise coordinates 69° 36.99 and 37° 30. 34.50 E in international waters from Russia's Kola Peninsula. At the site, 108 meters beneath the surface, the Russian nuclear-powered cruise missile submarine K-141 Kursk had just experienced catastrophic failure. The Kursk was an Oscar II-class vessel, among the largest and most capable submarines in the Russian Northern Fleet. Commissioned in 1995 after construction at the Sevmash shipyard in Severodvinsk, the submarine represented third-generation Soviet naval architecture. The hull measured 154 meters in length with a submerged displacement of 24,000 tons. Propulsion came from two VM-5 pressurized water reactors, each rated at 190 megawatts thermal output, driving twin turbines connected to 7-blade propellers. The submarine carried a crew of 107 under normal operations. On August 10, 2000, when the Kursk departed its home base at Vidyayevo in Uraguba Bay, 118 personnel were aboard, 111 standard crew members, 5 officers from 7th SSGN Division Headquarters, and 2 civilian designers. The mission was participation in a large-scale naval exercise in the Barents Sea. The submarine's armament configuration included 24 P-700 Granite anti-ship cruise missiles housed in tubes angled at approximately 40 degrees, arranged in 2 rows of 12 along each side of the sail. These weapons, designated SSN-19 by NATO, had a range of 550 kilometers and could be launched while the submarine remained submerged. For torpedo attack capability, the forward compartment contained 8 torpedo tubes, 4 with 650 mm diameter, and 4 with 533 mm diameter. The submarine could carry 24 torpedoes or anti-submarine warfare rockets in various configurations. The torpedo room, designated Compartment 1, occupied the bow section forward of the command spaces. The design philosophy underlying Soviet naval construction emphasized redundancy and compartmentation. The pressure hull was constructed from 50 mm HY-130 grade steel, surrounded by an outer hydrodynamic hull of 8 mm steel plating covered with up to 80 mm of sound-dampening rubber coating. The space between hulls, varying from 1 to 2 meters, contained ballast tanks, piping runs, and structural stiffeners. The interior was divided into 9 watertight compartments, separated by pressure-rated bulkheads and sealed hatches. This architecture intended to ensure that flooding in 1 or 2 compartments would not compromise overall buoyancy or survivability. The compartment sequence from bow to stern was I torpedo room, 2 command and control, II crew quarters and communications, 4 crew support, V auxiliary systems, 6 reactor compartment, 7 forward turbine space, VI aft turbine space, and 9 electric motors and emergency systems. Each compartment serves specific functions within the operational architecture. Compartment 6 housed both reactors side by side on the center line, with approximately 5 meters of clearance from the top of the reactor, vessels to the pressure hull ceiling, and 6 meters to the hull bottom. Primary cooling loops, steam generators, and main circulation pumps occupied the same compartment. Compartments 7 and 8 contained the steam turbines that converted reactor thermal output into mechanical shaft power. Compartment 9, the aftmost section, contained electric backup propulsion motors, emergency buoyancy equipment, and a dedicated rescue hatch designed for external submersible docking. A second rescue hatch was located in Compartment I at the bow, an emergency ascent buoy designed to release automatically upon casualty detection and float to the surface with communications equipment was mounted atop Compartment 7th. The weapons carried in the torpedo room represented accumulated technological development across decades of Cold War competition. Soviet naval doctrine prioritized long-range strikes against American carrier battle groups. This strategic requirement drove the development of weapon systems optimizing for range, speed, and reduced detectability. Conventional battery-electric torpedoes, while reliable and well understood, imposed limitations. Battery energy density constrained maximum range. Electrical discharge generated heat signatures detectable by modern sonar arrays. Operational flexibility suffered when mission profiles demanded extended underwater transit before weapon launch. High-test peroxide propulsion emerged as a solution to these constraints. Hydrogen peroxide, when concentrated above 85% purity, functions as a monopropellant. It decomposes exothermically without requiring a separate oxidizer. The decomposition reaction proceeds as 2H2O2, 2H2O plus O2, releasing approximately 98 kilojoules per mole. The resulting high-pressure steam and oxygen mixture drives a turbine directly, propelling the torpedo at speeds and ranges exceeding battery electric systems while producing minimal thermal signature. The chemical energy density of high-test peroxide substantially exceeds electrochemical battery storage, enabling torpedo designs with extended operational envelopes. This performance advantage carried inherent trade-offs. Hydrogen peroxide decomposition is autocatalytic. Once initiated, the reaction accelerates with increasing temperature. The activation energy for decomposition decreases in the presence of contamination. Trace quantities of organic compounds, metallic particles, chlorides, or reactive metals such as copper, iron, or manganese serve as catalysts, lowering the energy barrier and initiating runaway decomposition. The exothermic heat release raises the temperature of surrounding peroxide, which accelerates further decomposition in a positive feedback cycle. Under uncontrolled conditions, this process can transition from slow degradation to explosive detonation within seconds. Material compatibility becomes paramount in systems. This internal geometry assumed that decomposition would occur only in the designated reaction chamber under controlled conditions during powered flight. The storage compartment holding the bulk peroxide reserve was designed for containment, not for managing uncontrolled decomposition. Structural ratings assumed internal pressures corresponding to hydrostatic loads and propellant transfer operations, not the explosive pressure rise rates characteristic of autocatalytic runaway. Pressure relief mechanisms intended for gradual venting could not respond to detonation timescales measured in milliseconds. The weapons loaded aboard the Kursk had undergone prescribed pre-deployment inspections. These procedures included visual examination of external surfaces, verification of seal integrity, pressure testing of propellant compartments, and documentation review confirming that weapons met serviceability standards. Inspectors looked for obvious signs of deterioration, corrosion, seal deformation, pressure anomalies, or visible contamination. However, the inspection methodology possessed inherent limitations. Visual examination cannot detect subsurface passivation layer degradation. Pressure testing at static conditions does not reveal dynamic response to thermal transients. Contamination below visible thresholds may still exceed safe chemical margins when combined with thermal activation. The decision logic embedded in inspection protocols reflected institutional pressures beyond pure technical assessment. Weapons that showed no obvious defects and met documented acceptance criteria were certified as serviceable. The alternative, rejecting weapons based on ambiguous condition indicators or exceeding conservative replacement schedules, would reduce available inventory and impact operational readiness. In resource-constrained environments, the bias tends toward accepting marginal conditions rather than imposing strict rejection criteria. This bias is not negligence, it is the rational response to competing institutional demands. When the Kursk submerged on the morning of August 12 and maneuvered into position for the exercise torpedo attack simulation, all systems functioned within normal parameters. The crew operated according to established procedures. The weapons had passed certification inspections. No warning indicators suggested abnormal conditions. The information architecture provided no signal that differentiated this moment from any previous operational evolution. And yet, within one of the type, 65 to 76 torpedoes in the torpedo room, conditions had aligned that would trigger irreversible failure. Somewhere within the propellant storage compartment, contamination existed. The source might have been a degraded seal allowing moisture and salt intrusion during prior loading cycles. It might have been residual cleaning solvent not fully removed during depot maintenance. It might have been microscopic metal particles generated by wear between moving components. It might have been organic compounds leached from elastomer seals exposed to thermal cycling over years of storage. The specific contamination source ultimately mattered less than the fact that it was present, chemically active, and in contact with concentrated hydrogen peroxide. The submarine's operational environment provided the final necessary condition: thermal energy. Seawater at the operating depth maintained a temperature several degrees above freezing. The torpedo room, located within the pressure hull, operated at ambient submarine temperature, warmer than external seawater but subject to variation based on air circulation, equipment operation, and depth changes. The weapons themselves had undergone thermal cycling, storage at varying temperatures ashore, transport in unheated vehicles, loading operations in cold water, and subsequent warming within the submarine's controlled atmosphere. Each cycle subjected seals and internal components to expansion and contraction, progressively degrading material integrity. At some point, the combination of contamination concentration and thermal energy reached the activation threshold for decomposition. The initial reaction was localized, involving a small volume of peroxide in contact with the contamination site. The heat released raised the temperature of adjacent peroxide molecules. The elevated temperature increased the reaction rate. More peroxide decomposed, releasing more heat, accelerating the reaction further. The positive feedback loop inherent in the autocatalytic mechanism drove the system toward runaway. The time frame from initiation to structural failure was determined by chemical kinetics and physical geometry, not by human decision-making. Once the activation threshold was crossed, the reaction proceeded according to the thermodynamic properties of the system. Temperature rose exponentially. Pressure within the sealed compartment increased proportionally. The torpedo casing, designed for external hydrodynamic loads and controlled internal pressures, experienced loading conditions far exceeding design margins. Welds, seams, or valve seats failed first, whichever constituted the weakest structural element under the specific stress distribution. When the containment breached, high-pressure decomposition products vented into the surrounding space. The sudden release constituted the first explosion detected by seismic monitors at 7:28:27 GMT, measuring 1.5 on the Richter scale. The pressure wave propagated through the torpedo room, subjecting adjacent weapons to shock loading and thermal pulse. Other Type 65 to 76A torpedoes, also containing hydrogen peroxide propellant, experienced sudden pressure and temperature spikes. Shockwaves can initiate decomposition in previously stable peroxide by providing mechanical activation energy. The thermal pulse raises temperature above ambient, accelerating any incipient decomposition already present due to contamination. Within the confined space of Compartment 1, multiple weapons now contained hydrogen peroxide undergoing or approaching runaway decomposition. The cascade was deterministic. High-explosive warheads designed to detonate under specific shock, temperature, or electrical initiation conditions experienced loading combinations exceeding design thresholds. The first explosion created the conditions that made subsequent explosions inevitable. 135 seconds elapsed between the two seismic events. This interval represents the propagation time through multiple failure stages: initial torpedo rupture, sympathetic initiation of adjacent weapons, pressure and temperature rise in those weapons, structural failure releasing additional decomposition products, and finally detonation of high-explosive warheads. The second explosion, measuring 3.5 on the Richter scale, released energy equivalent to between 2 and 7 tons of TNT detonating simultaneously. This energy release occurred inside the pressure hull, concentrated in the forward compartments. The submarine's compartmentation system was designed to manage external flooding. Torpedo impact on the hull exterior mine detonation beneath the keel, or collision damage would breach the outer hull and allow seawater ingress. Compartment bulkheads and watertight doors would contain flooding to damaged sections. Reserve buoyancy in undamaged compartments would maintain positive buoyancy and allow controlled surfacing, or, at minimum, prevent sinking. The design basis assumed progressive flooding, measured in minutes to hours, allowing crew response and damage control actions. Internal explosion imposed loading conditions entirely outside this design basis. Overpressure propagated radially in all directions simultaneously. The blast wave traveled through air at acoustic velocity, impacting bulkheads, equipment, and structural members with peak pressures orders of magnitude above normal operating conditions. The pressure hull, designed to resist external hydrostatic compression, experienced internal tension loading. Welds and seams, optimized for one loading direction, failed under reversed stress. Cable and pipe penetrations through bulkheads, sealed for watertightness, could not contain high-velocity gas flow. The blast wave propagated through these penetrations, bypassing the intended isolation between compartments. The forward section of the submarine, encompassing approximately 18 meters of the bow including compartments I and II, suffered catastrophic structural failure. The pressure hull ruptured, the outer hull disintegrated, internal components, control systems, bunks, equipment racks, piping, cables fragmented into debris. Personnel in these compartments experienced instantaneous fatal trauma. Survival time was measured in milliseconds, not seconds. No protective action was possible. Aft of compartment 2, structural damage transitioned from total destruction to severe impairment. Compartment 3 experienced blast wave propagation through cable runs and ventilation trunks. Fires initiated by electrical short circuits and ruptured fuel lines added thermal damage to mechanical shock. Bulkheads deformed but did not fully fail. Compartments 4 through 9, progressively further from the blast epicenter, remained structurally intact. The crew members in these spaces survived the initial explosion. They experienced violent motion, loss of lighting, failure of communication systems, and immediate recognition that a catastrophic casualty had occurred. But they were alive. The submarine's reactor protection systems detected the shock transient and initiated emergency shutdown automatically. Control rods inserted fully within seconds, terminating the fission chain reaction. Reactor thermal output dropped from 190 megawatts to residual decay heat levels. Primary cooling flow continued briefly under natural circulation before pumps lost power. The reactors transitioned to safe shutdown configuration without operator intervention, exactly as designed. Seawater, now possessing unrestricted access through the breached forward hull, flooded the destroyed compartments at a rate determined by breach area and hydrostatic pressure at 108 meters depth. Approximately 1.1 megapascals of pressure 11 times atmospheric drove seawater into every void space. The submarine's buoyancy, previously maintained by the air-filled volume within the pressure hull, decreased as water displaced air. The bow-down moment increased as forward compartments flooded while aft compartments remained intact. The submarine lost trim and began descending stern first at an increasing angle. Without propulsion, how can a weapons system designed to provide tactical advantage become the mechanism through which design validation assumptions prove incompatible with operational constraints? The answer lies in recognizing that safety margins exist not in the hardware alone, but in the complete system: the hardware, the procedures, the training, the institutional support, the economic resources, and the operational tempo. When any element of that system degrades below the level assumed during design, the margins erode invisibly until conditions align to reveal the gap. At that point, the failure is no longer preventable by the operators present, because the conditions that enabled it were established long before. The conditions that enabled the August 12 explosion did not originate on that date. They accumulated across years through the interaction of institutional constraints, material degradation, procedural adaptation, and operational normalization. The maintenance logs, inspection records, and crew training documentation from the Kursk and similar vessels reveal a pattern, not of negligence or incompetence, but of systematic adaptation to resource scarcity within an operational framework that assumed resource availability. The latent failures were documented, visible to those who examine the records, and yet interpreted as acceptable variations within normal operating parameters rather than warning indicators of accumulated risk. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. The Russian Federation inherited the naval infrastructure, vessel inventory, and operational commitments of the Soviet Navy without inheriting equivalent funding levels. Defense budgets contracted sharply through the 1992nd. The Northern Fleet, headquartered at Severomorsk on the Kola Peninsula, operated strategic ballistic missile submarines, cruise missile attack submarines like the Kursk, and supporting surface vessels and aircraft. Maintaining this force structure required continuous expenditure on fuel, spare parts, crew salaries, shore infrastructure, training facilities, and weapon stockpiles. Each budget reduction forced prioritization decisions, which systems to maintain fully, which to defer, which to accept at degraded capability. Submarine maintenance follows cyclical schedules driven by operational hours, calendar time, and component condition. Major overhauls conducted at shipyard facilities address hull integrity, reactor refueling, propulsion system rebuilds, and weapons system certification. Intermediate maintenance, conducted at fleet bases, handles component replacement, systems testing, and preventive maintenance on critical equipment. Routine maintenance, performed by ship's force during operational periods, addresses daily upkeep and minor repairs. Each level requires specialized tools, trained personnel, technical documentation, and spare parts inventory. The Kursk's maintenance history reflected the broader fleet resource constraints. The submarine entered service in 1995, relatively late in the post-Soviet period. Initial commissioning included full systems validation and crew training under the oversight of shipyard personnel and design bureau representatives. The first operational years proceeded with maintenance schedules largely intact, supported by remaining Soviet-era spare parts stocks and personnel continuity. By 1998 to 1999, however, budget pressures intensified. Pier time between deployments extended. Scheduled maintenance actions were deferred. Spare parts requisitions encountered longer lead times or outright unavailability. Crew turnover increased as experienced personnel left for civilian employment offering better compensation. The weapon systems aboard the submarine faced particular challenges. Torpedoes, unlike the submarine's hull and propulsion systems, were not integral components serviced continuously by the crew. Weapons were loaded from shore-based magazines before deployments and offloaded afterward. Maintenance responsibility resided with weapons depot personnel, not submarine crews. Depot-level facilities manage storage, inspection, and maintenance cycles for weapons across the entire fleet. When depot funding declined, the impact cascaded across all submarines drawing weapons from that inventory. High-test peroxide torpedoes imposed maintenance requirements substantially more demanding than conventional battery-electric weapons. Storage temperature control prevented accelerated decomposition. Humidity management prevented moisture intrusion. Periodic drainage and inspection verified internal condition. Chemical purity testing confirmed propellant quality. Seal replacement occurred at prescribed intervals regardless of visible wear. Passivation layer maintenance required specialized surface treatment equipment. Each requirement assumed resource availability, climate-controlled storage facilities, chemical analysis laboratories, trained technicians, replacement component stocks, and institutional processes, ensuring that maintenance occurred on schedule. The documentation available from the period indicates that formal procedures remained in effect. Inspection checklists specified the required verification steps. Maintenance interval schedules defined when actions should occur. Quality control signatures certified that weapons met acceptance standards before issue to operational units. On paper, the system functioned. In practice, the gap between procedural intent and actual execution widened progressively. Inspection protocols for Type 6576 torpedoes required visual examination of external surfaces, seal condition assessment, pressure testing of propellant compartments, and verification that no obvious contamination indicators existed. The inspector looked for corrosion, seal deformation, pressure decay over time, or visible residues. If none were observed, and documentation showed the weapon remained within service life limits, the weapon received certification for operational use. This protocol assumed that observable defects correlated reliably with safety margins, that dangerous conditions would manifest as detectable symptoms before reaching critical thresholds. The assumption failed to account for subsurface degradation processes. Passivation layers thin from the inside through chemical attack, invisible to external inspection. Seals develop microcracks that allow slow contamination ingress without visible deformation. Contaminants accumulate in internal void spaces inaccessible to visual inspection. Temperature cycling progressively weakens material properties without changing external appearance. A weapon can pass every prescribed inspection checkpoint, while internal conditions have degraded to hazardous levels. Chemical purity testing could detect contamination, but required extracting propellant samples and conducting laboratory analysis. This procedure was time-consuming, required specialized equipment, generated disposal concerns for the extracted peroxide, and temporarily removed the weapon from available inventory. Depot-level facilities could perform such testing during major maintenance cycles, but routine pre-deployment inspections did not include chemical analysis. The inspection protocol optimized for operational availability, not for conservative contamination detection. The institutional incentive structure reinforced acceptance bias. Rejecting a weapon reduced available inventory. If replacement weapons were scarce or unavailable, rejection meant deploying with incomplete loadouts, which impacted mission capability ratings and reflected poorly on logistics chains and depot management. Conversely, accepting marginal weapons that subsequently functioned without incident validated the decision. Only a failure would retrospectively identify the acceptance as incorrect, and failures were rare events, not routine occurrences. The feedback signal rewarded optimistic interpretation. Crew training on high-test peroxide handling focused on procedural compliance rather than hazard phenomenology. Submarine personnel learned the steps for loading weapons into torpedo tubes, verifying arming circuits, programming targeting data, and launching according to tactical requirements. They learned that hydrogen peroxide was reactive and required careful handling, but the curriculum emphasized procedural rules rather than chemical mechanism understanding. The distinction mattered. Rule following assumes procedures are comprehensive and current, while mechanism understanding enables recognition of novel hazard indicators not explicitly covered in checklists. The training deficit was structural, not individual. Submarine crew training curricula addressed hundreds of systems and emergency scenarios. Time allocated to weapons handling competed with reactor operations, damage control, navigation, communications, and tactical employment training. High-test peroxide torpedoes represented one weapon type among several. The training investment reflected assessed priority. Since catastrophic torpedo failures were historically rare, training hours prioritized more probable casualty scenarios: flooding, fire, reactor emergencies, and collision. Institutional memory regarding hydrogen peroxide hazards resided primarily among personnel who had served when the weapons were first introduced or who had responded to earlier incidents. The British Royal Navy submarine HMS Sidon sank pierside in 1955 after a hydrogen peroxide torpedo exploded during maintenance, killing 13 personnel. Soviet naval development had proceeded with awareness of this risk, implementing safety protocols intended to prevent recurrence. However, the personnel who participated in that development and retained vivid understanding of the hazard mechanisms had largely retired by 2000. Their replacements learned procedures, but not necessarily the underlying risk phenomenology that motivated those procedures. Material aging represented another latent condition accumulating over time. Elastomer seals, designed for 5 to 10-year service lives, degraded through oxidative attack, plasticizer loss, and mechanical stress cycling. Manufacturers. The Kursk's weapons loadout for the August 2000 exercise included Type 65 to 76, torpedoes drawn from depot inventory. The specific weapons selected had undergone pre-deployment inspections and received certification for operational use. The inspection records, reviewed after the accident, showed no rejected items or noted deficiencies requiring corrective action. Every checkpoint had been satisfied. The weapons met documented acceptance criteria. From a procedural compliance standpoint, The process functioned as designed. Yet the gap between meeting acceptance criteria and possessing adequate safety margin can be substantial when acceptance criteria are calibrated for availability rather than conservative risk assessment. A weapon that passes visual inspection, holds pressure for the specified test duration, and remains within calendar service limits has met the formal requirements. Whether the internal contamination level, seal microcrack density, and passivation layer integrity leaves sufficient margin against runaway decomposition under operational thermal conditions is a different question, one not answered by the inspection protocol. The human factors literature identifies this pattern as normalization of deviance. The term describes the gradual process by which practices that deviate from original safety margins become accepted as normal through repeated non-failure. Each instance where a marginally acceptable weapon functions successfully reinforces the judgment that marginal conditions are adequate. The acceptable range expands incrementally. Deviations that would have triggered rejection under original conservative standards become routine under adapted standards calibrated by operational experience. The process operates without conscious recognition. Inspectors do not decide to accept hazardous weapons. They apply judgment within the framework of available information, institutional expectations, and resource constraints. A seal that shows slight hardening but no visible cracking might have been rejected under more conservative criteria, or when replacement seals were readily available. When replacement seals require months of lead time and the weapon otherwise appears serviceable, the judgment shifts toward acceptance. Each similar judgment, repeated across many weapons and many inspections, creates a fleet-wide condition where marginal component states become the norm rather than the exception. Organizational culture influences these judgments through subtle signals. If leadership emphasizes operational readiness and mission capability, personnel interpret ambiguous conditions through that lens. If budget reviews focus on maintenance, cost control, and inventory availability, depot managers optimize toward those metrics. If promotion and performance evaluation reward keeping submarines at sea rather than conservative asset management, the incentive structure aligns toward acceptance rather than rejection. No individual decision appears unreasonable in context, yet the cumulative effect progressively erodes safety margins. The Kursk's crew, loading weapons for the exercise, had no reason to question certification status. The weapons arrived with documentation indicating they met requirements. The crew's responsibility was proper handling during loading, verification of mechanical and electrical interfaces, and adherence to stowage procedures. They were not equipped, trained, or expected to perform independent weapons system safety assessments. The Division of Responsibility Depot certifies weapons. Crew operates submarine assumed that certification was reliable. If that assumption held, the system worked efficiently. If certification quality had degraded due to resource constraints, the crew had no mechanism to detect the gap. The submarine's operating environment imposed additional stresses beyond shore storage conditions. Loading weapons through torpedo tubes exposed them to seawater contact during transfer. Tube internal surfaces, despite regular maintenance, accumulated salt deposits and corrosion products. The torpedo room atmosphere, while temperature-controlled, varied with operational depth, ambient seawater temperature, and internal equipment heat loads. Weapons experienced thermal cycling as the submarine transitioned between surface, shallow, and deep operating depths. Mechanical vibration from propulsion systems, sea state motion, and acoustic transients subjected internal components to dynamic loading. Each environmental exposure represented a minor deviation from ideal storage conditions. Individually, none exceeded design tolerances. Cumulatively, over months or years, they contributed to progressive material degradation. A seal subjected to 50 thermal cycles degrades more than a seal subjected to 5 cycles. A passivation layer exposed to humid salt air corrodes faster than one in dry, temperature-stable storage. The operational environment accelerated aging beyond the rates assumed during design qualification testing. The weapons loaded aboard the Kursk on August 10, 2000, carried histories of manufacture dates, storage durations, prior deployment cycles, maintenance actions, and inspection results documented in logbooks maintained at depot and shipboard levels. After the accident, investigators reviewed these records searching for anomalies that might have provided warning. The records showed routine maintenance, periodic inspections, and compliance with existing standards. They did not show that standards themselves had eroded relative to the safety margins required by the chemical system's inherent properties. The latent conditions were not hidden. They existed in maintenance deferral records, spare parts shortage reports, training curriculum reductions, and budget constraint documentation. They existed in the gap between designed maintenance intervals and actually achieved intervals. They existed in the increasing age of components in service, the declining frequency of chemical purity testing, and the extension of weapons service lives beyond original specifications. Each condition was documented, reported, and known to someone within the institutional hierarchy. None, individually, appeared catastrophic. The system continued to function. Weapons launched successfully. Exercises proceeded. Deployments completed. The failure mode that manifested on August 12 required a specific combination: contamination present, thermal conditions sufficient to initiate decomposition, and accumulated degradation eliminating the safety margin that would have prevented ignition. This combination was statistically unlikely in any single weapon at any single moment, but the probability increased with fleet size, time in service, and erosion of maintenance quality. Given a large enough inventory of aging weapons, inspected under resource-constrained protocols, operated under environmental stresses, the question was not whether a failure would occur, but when. Human factors analysis distinguishes between errors and violations. An error is an unintended action, a mistake or slip. A violation is an intentional deviation from procedure. The maintenance and inspection activities leading to the Kursk disaster involved neither. Personnel followed procedures as written. They applied judgment within their training and authority. They met documentation requirements. The system failure emerged not from individual human error, but from the mismatch between procedural assumptions and operational reality. A latent organizational failure embedded in resource allocation, training priorities, inspection protocol design, and institutional incentive structures. The design philosophy that made compartmentation a safety feature assumed casualties would be external: flooding from hull breach, fire from battle damage or equipment failure, reactor incidents contained by multiple barriers. The assumption that internal weapons explosion was implausible appeared validated by operational experience. Decades of service with thousands of weapon loadings had produced no catastrophic torpedo room explosions. The absence of prior failure reinforced confidence that existing protocols were adequate. The assumption was not unreasonable given available evidence, until August 12, 2000, when the accumulated latent conditions converged to invalidate it. In the control room on the morning of August 12, the crew prepared for exercise evolutions according to routine procedures. The submarine had submerged and was maneuvering into position for simulated attack runs. Weapons systems were powered and ready. Communications with Exercise Control Authority confirmed targeting data and launch windows. Environmental conditions were normal, moderate sea state, good acoustic propagation, no unusual contacts or hazards. The operational situation contained nothing remarkable, exactly the kind of routine training evolution that submariners conduct repeatedly throughout their careers. At 7:28:27 GMT, the first explosion occurred. The crew, in AFT compartments, experienced violent motion, loss of lighting, alarm activation, and immediate recognition that something catastrophic had happened forward. Training initiated conditioned responses: assess immediate hazards, activate emergency systems, report to command authority, prepare for damage control, but the scale of damage exceeded any training scenario. Communication with forward spaces returned nothing. Instrumentation showed flooding, loss of control, loss of propulsion, and indications incompatible with survivable casualty. The latent conditions that accumulated over years had reached their inevitable conclusion. The maintenance gaps, inspection protocol limitations, material degradation, training deficits, and institutional pressures had created a fleet-wide vulnerability. The Kursk became the statistical realization of that vulnerability, not because its crew or maintenance personnel were less capable than others, but because the conditions were systemic. Any submarine loading similar weapons from the same depot inventory under the same resource constraints faced equivalent risk. The question that must be confronted is not, how did this crew fail, but rather how did institutional structures create conditions where failure became inevitable? The answer lies in recognizing that safety margins exist at system level, not component level. A weapon with degraded seals, marginal passivation, and trace contamination can be individually acceptable under inspection criteria, while being systemically hazardous when combined with thermal environments, vibration exposure, and extended service duration. The inspection certified the component, but the system integration created risk. Latent organizational failures differ from active failures in their temporal characteristics. An active failure, an operator pressing the wrong button, a maintainer improperly torquing a bolt, produces immediate consequences. Cause and effect are temporally proximate. Latent failures accumulate over months or years, invisible until conditions align to activate them. The maintenance deferral in 1997 did not cause immediate harm. The training curriculum reduction in 1998 produced no instant casualty. The spare parts shortage in 1999 generated no crisis. But each contributed to the progressive erosion of the safety margin that would be exhausted on August 12, 2000. James Reason's Swiss cheese model of organizational accidents provides a useful framework. Each defensive layer design, manufacturing, inspection, maintenance, training, operation contains weaknesses analogous to holes in Swiss cheese slices. Normally, the holes in different layers don't align, so hazards are blocked. Latent failures progressively enlarge holes and reduce defensive layer effectiveness until, at a particular moment, holes align across all layers simultaneously, allowing the hazard to propagate through to cause harm. The Kursk disaster resulted from such alignment. Design assumptions about operational environment, manufacturing quality degraded by time, inspection protocols inadequate for contamination detection, maintenance deferred by resource constraints, training insufficient for hazard recognition, and operational thermal conditions sufficient to initiate decomposition. The crew in the AFT compartments, assessing their situation minutes after the explosion, faced a circumstance wholly outside their training and experience. The submarine lay on the bottom. Forward compartments were destroyed. Rescue would require external assistance. Their immediate survival depended on isolating themselves in intact spaces and managing life support until help arrived. They had no way to know whether rescue assets existed, how quickly they could respond, or whether response would arrive before life support was exhausted. They made decisions under radical uncertainty, with no information except the physical evidence immediately around them. The latent failures that brought the submarine to the seabed had set the initial conditions. What followed would test whether the assumptions embedded in rescue system design aligned with operational reality any better than the assumptions about weapons systems safety. The same institutional and resource constraints that affected maintenance and inspection also affected rescue capability, training, equipment readiness, and response coordination. The crew's survival now depended on whether the defensive systems designed for this contingency possessed the margins necessary to function despite those constraints. The transition from latent risk to active failure occurred at a threshold that could not be observed by the crew. No instrumentation monitored the internal temperature of stored torpedoes. No sensors detected contamination levels within sealed propellant compartments. No alarm systems provided advance warning that chemical conditions had reached activation energy for autocatalytic decomposition. The initiating event existed at the molecular scale: chemical bonds breaking, exothermic reactions accelerating, thermal energy accumulating, in a volume inaccessible to measurement or intervention. By the time physical effects became observable, the reaction timescale had already diverged from any possible human response timescale. The Kursk was operating at approximately 108 meters depth, proceeding at low speed in the designated exercise area. Seawater temperature at this depth ranged from 2 to 4 degrees Celsius, typical for the Barents Sea in August. The submarine's internal atmosphere was maintained near 20 degrees Celsius through climate control systems that balanced equipment heat loads against heat loss through the hull. The torpedo room temperature fluctuated within a few degrees of this set point depending on ventilation flow patterns and proximity to machinery spaces. Weapons stored in torpedo tubes experienced temperatures slightly cooler than those in ready service racks due to thermal conduction through tube walls to seawater. One of the type 65 to 76, torpedoes in the forward tubes contained contamination that had accumulated through mechanisms discussed previously: seal degradation allowing moisture intrusion, organic residues from handling, metallic particles from component wear, or degradation of passivation layers exposing reactive surfaces. The contamination concentration at any particular location within the propellant volume varied. Some regions might contain parts per million levels insufficient to initiate reaction. Other regions, particularly near degraded seals or corroded surfaces, might contain far higher concentrations. Hydrogen peroxide decomposition kinetics depend on temperature through the Arrhenius equation, which quantifies how reaction rates increase exponentially with temperature. At the storage temperature range approximately 15 to 20 degrees Celsius, pure hydrogen peroxide is metastable. Background decomposition occurs slowly, at rates that would take years to substantially degrade the propellant if no contamination were present. Contamination reduces the activation energy required to initiate faster decomposition. Each contaminant type catalyzes the reaction through different mechanisms, but all share the property of lowering the energy barrier. At some moment during the morning of August 12th, conditions within the contaminated region crossed the threshold. Perhaps the submarine's maneuvering had generated sloshing that brought contamination into contact with a larger peroxide volume. Perhaps thermal stratification in the torpedo had concentrated heat in a particular region. Perhaps a micro-vibration from machinery operation had dislodged accumulated contamination particles, suddenly exposing fresh surface area. The specific trigger mattered less than the fact that once decomposition began, the reaction became self-sustaining. The initial reaction volume was small, possibly milliliters or less, but the heat released raised the temperature of surrounding peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide at elevated temperature decomposes faster. The decomposition released more heat, raising temperature further. The positive feedback loop, inherent in autocatalytic reactions, drove the process toward exponential growth. Reaction rate doubled with each incremental temperature rise. What began as localized warming within seconds became a thermal runaway propagating through the propellant volume. As temperature rose, peroxide transitioned from liquid to vapor. The decomposition products, water vapor and oxygen gas, occupied far greater volume than the liquid reactant. Pressure inside the sealed propellant compartment increased proportionally to temperature and vapor generation rate. The torpedo casing was designed to withstand external hydrostatic pressure and internal pressures corresponding to normal propellant transfer operations, typically a few megapascals. The pressure rise from runaway decomposition exceeded these margins within seconds. Structural failure initiated at the weakest point under the specific stress distribution: a weld seam, a valve seat, a compartment bulkhead, or a seal gland. Forensic analysis of recovered torpedo fragments later indicated that failure occurred in the propellant compartment, consistent with internal overpressure rupture. The casing split, releasing high-pressure decomposition gases explosively into the torpedo room. The first seismic event, recorded at 7:28:27 GMT with magnitude 1.5, corresponded to this rupture. The pressure wave propagated through the water-filled torpedo room at acoustic velocity, approximately 1,500 meters per second. Equipment, structural members, adjacent weapons, and personnel experienced sudden overpressure loading. The shock wave reflected off the pressure hull boundaries, creating complex interference patterns that intensified pressure peaks at certain locations and created rarefaction zones at others. Adjacent torpedoes, particularly other Type 65 to 76, weapons containing hydrogen peroxide, experienced mechanical shock and thermal pulse simultaneously. Shock waves transmitted through the torpedo casing structure induced stress waves in internal components. If contamination existed in those weapons, and given the fleet-wide conditions it likely did, the shock provided mechanical activation energy that could initiate decomposition in previously stable volumes. Simultaneously, the thermal pulse from the initial rupture raised ambient temperature throughout the torpedo room. The Type 65 to 76, a design included high explosive warheads forward of the propulsion and propellant sections. These warheads were designed with safety mechanisms to prevent accidental detonation during handling or minor casualty scenarios. However, the design basis for accidental detonation prevention assumed credible accidents, dropping during loading, minor fire exposure, electrical fault in arming circuits. The design did not anticipate a scenario where multiple weapons simultaneously experienced structural rupture from internal chemical decomposition, while subjected to external shock and thermal loading from adjacent weapons already exploding. The warhead detonation threshold involves shock pressure, temperature, and duration. Small shocks of brief duration may not provide sufficient energy to overcome the activation barrier for detonation. Larger shocks or sustained thermal exposure can. Fire propagated through compartment 2 as electrical insulation ignited. Lubricating oils vaporized and burned, and combustible materials exposed to thermal radiation reached ignition temperature. The atmosphere filled with toxic combustion products, carbon monoxide, hydrogen cyanide from burning plastics, and particulates. Even personnel who survived the initial blast faced an environment rapidly becoming non-survivable. The forward, approximately 18 meters of the submarine, all of Compartment 1 and most of Compartment 2, was destroyed or severely damaged within seconds of the second explosion. The pressure hull breached in multiple locations, allowing seawater at 1.1 megapascals hydrostatic pressure to flood the destroyed compartments. Seawater entering through large breaches flows at velocities determined by pressure differential and aperture size, measured in tens of meters per second. Compartments I and II flooded completely within 1 or 2 minutes. The submarine's buoyancy depends on maintaining air-filled volume within the pressure hull. As water displaced air in the forward compartments, the bow became negatively buoyant while the aft sections remained positively buoyant. This created a bow-down pitching moment. Simultaneously, the mass of water flooding forward shifted the submarine's center of gravity forward and downward. With propulsion lost, control surfaces powerless, and no means to pump ballast, the submarine began descending nose first. In Compartment 2 crew quarters, radio room, and auxiliary equipment spaces, personnel experienced violent motion, loss of lighting, failure of communication systems, and the unmistakable sound and vibration signature of explosion and flooding forward. Training conditioned immediate responses. Don emergency breathing apparatus. Activate emergency lighting. Attempt communication with other compartments. Assess local damage. Prepare to seal bulkheads. But the scale of casualty immediately apparent from the severity of the shock and the failure of all forward-looking instrumentation indicated this was not a survivable scenario for forward personnel. The reactor compartment, Compartment 6, was separated from Compartment 3 by the intervening compartments 4 and 5th distance, and multiple bulkheads attenuated blast effects substantially. However, the shock wave transmitted through the hull structure with sufficient magnitude to trigger reactor protection system instrumentation. Accelerometers and pressure sensors detecting transient mechanical shock above threshold values initiated automatic emergency shutdown scram within milliseconds. Control rods, held withdrawn by electromagnetic force during normal operation, released and inserted fully into the reactor cores under spring and gravity force. Neutron absorption by the control rod material terminated the fission chain reaction. Reactor thermal power dropped from 190 megawatts to decay heat levels, approximately 5 to 10% of operating power within seconds. Primary coolant flow continued briefly under natural circulation as temperature differentials between hot and cold legs drove convective flow. The steam generators continued extracting heat from the primary circuit, but electrical power loss from the explosion meant that reactor coolant pumps stopped, turbine control systems de-energized, and secondary side feedwater flow ceased. The reactors entered a stable configuration, shut down, cooling passively, with primary system integrity maintained. The reactor protection system had functioned exactly as designed, preventing core damage despite the casualty. Personnel in the reactor compartment recognized from instrumentation indications and physical sensations that a major casualty had occurred forward. Communication attempts yielded nothing. The sound-powered phone circuits that provided backup communication independent of electrical systems received no response from forward compartments. The crew initiated damage control protocols, verify reactor status, maintain cooling if possible, prepare for evacuation if flooding propagates aft, attempt to establish contact with any survivors elsewhere in the submarine. Compartments 7, 8, and 9, the turbine machinery spaces, and aftmost auxiliary and emergency equipment section, remained structurally intact. Personnel in these spaces also experienced the shock and recognized the severity. The loss of propulsion, loss of electrical power, and violent motion indicated catastrophic failure. Training emphasized that survival in such scenarios depended on isolating intact compartments, conserving life support resources, and awaiting rescue. With communication forward impossible and all indications suggesting the forward section was destroyed in flooding, the rational decision was to move aft and seal bulkheads to prevent further flooding propagation. The submarine's descent accelerated as forward compartments completed flooding. Hydrodynamic forces during the descent essentially falling through water generated additional structural loading. The bow, being heavier and more streamlined, descended faster than the stern. The submarine rotated to an increasingly steep nose-down angle, estimated at approximately 20 degrees based on post-accident seabed surveys. At this angle, unsecured equipment slid forward, personnel struggled to maintain footing, and the physical environment became disorienting and hazardous even in undamaged compartments. The seabed in this region of the Barents Sea lies at relatively consistent depth near 108 meters. The submarine impacted bow first. The impact speed, determined by descent rate and drag, likely ranged from 3 to 5 meters per second, a controlled crash rather than free fall, but still sufficient to cause significant structural shock. The already destroyed forward section absorbed much of the impact energy through further deformation and fragmentation. The intact aft sections experienced deceleration loading but remained structurally sound. Post-impact, the submarine came to rest at a slight list, to port approximately 1.5 degrees according to later surveys. The bow was embedded in seabed sediment. The stern remained elevated above the seabed datum. The rescue hatch in compartment 9, designed to provide emergency escape or access for external rescue submersibles, was oriented at an angle to the vertical, complicating docking operations but not necessarily preventing them. Inside the aft compartments, the crew faced an environment transformed from routine operations to survival emergency in under 5 minutes. They had breathable air, but that air would not remain breathable indefinitely. Oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production by the crew would progressively degrade atmospheric quality. Emergency oxygen generation systems could extend this period. The Norwegian seismic array data, the most objective record of the event, showed unambiguously that 2 distinct explosions occurred 135 seconds apart. This timeline proved critical to later forensic analysis. A single explosion might suggest external attack torpedo impact or mine detonation. 2 explosions, with the second far more powerful, indicated a cascading internal failure, initial event triggering conditions that led to a larger secondary event. The time interval was consistent with thermal and pressure propagation through multiple weapon systems, not with any external attack scenario. International monitoring systems, including those operated by the United States and Canada, recorded the same events independently, providing confirmation and triangulation. The location coordinates derived from multiple seismic stations agreed within measurement uncertainty. The magnitude estimates varied slightly among stations due to differences in seismometer characteristics and data processing algorithms, but all confirmed the basic pattern: small event followed by large event, both originating from the same location in the Barents Sea. Surface vessels participating in the exercise, including Russian naval vessels and potentially submarines from other nations monitoring the exercise, detected the explosions acoustically through hull-mounted hydrophones or towed sonar arrays. Underwater acoustic propagation in the Barents Sea environment permits detection at ranges of hundreds of kilometers for events of this magnitude. The acoustic signatures would have appeared suddenly on monitoring displays without prior indication of developing problems. Russian Naval Command initially did not recognize the events as submarine distress. Several hours elapsed before the determination was made that the Kursk was missing and that the seismic events correlated with its last known location. This delay, measured in 12 to 18 hours before full emergency response activation, consumed a substantial portion of the available survival time. The reasons for the delay involved communication protocols, reluctance to acknowledge casualties, and institutional dynamics beyond the scope of physical system analysis, but critically important to the outcome. The physical event torpedoes exploding, submarine sinking, crew trapped occurred deterministically according to chemical kinetics, structural mechanics, and hydrodynamic principles. The human and organizational response or lack thereof occurred according to institutional dynamics, communication protocols, and decision-making under uncertainty. The combination determined whether the crew's survival time exceeded the rescue response time. The initiating event had occurred at the molecular scale, invisible and unmeasurable, crossing a threshold determined by contamination chemistry and thermal conditions. The divergence from normal operations to catastrophic failure occupied seconds, not minutes, driven by autocatalytic kinetics that offered no warning and no intervention opportunity. By the time human perception registered that something had occurred, the physical sequence was complete and irreversible. The question now was whether the organizational and technical systems designed for rescue could respond before the survival window closed. The energy released during the second explosion propagated through the submarine structure as stress waves traveling at the acoustic velocity of steel approximately 5,000 meters per second. These waves carried sufficient energy to cause permanent deformation in structural members, rupture welds, and breach the pressure hull in multiple locations. The compartmented architecture that provided survivability against external flooding became a complex three-dimensional environment where blast overpressure, fragmentation, fire, and toxic gas propagated through design pathways and unintended vulnerabilities. Understanding the failure chain requires examining not only what was destroyed, but why the destruction pattern followed the specific geometry it did, and why compartmentation, a deliberate safety feature, proved insufficient against this particular casualty mechanism. The submarine's pressure hull structure consisted of cylindrical shell sections connected by ring frames and bulkheads. The 50mm thick high 130 steel hull provided strength to resist external hydrostatic pressure at operating depth. At 600 meters design depth, external pressure approaches 60 atmospheres, 6 megapascals. The hull and ring frames were engineered to distribute this compressive loading evenly around the circumference, preventing buckling or collapse. Material selection, heat treatment, welding procedures, and quality control ensured that the hull met stringent strength and toughness specifications. However, the loading case for internal explosion differed fundamentally from external hydrostatic pressure. Internal overpressure creates tensile hoop stress in the cylindrical shell. The hull is pushed outward rather than compressed inward. Steel's tensile strength and compressive strength differ, and structural members optimized for compression may have lower factors of safety under tension. More critically, welds that join hull plates or connect frames to shell sections concentrate stress under tensile loading. Crack initiation preferentially occurs at these locations when the material experiences loading beyond its yield strength. The blast wave from the second explosion originated in compartment 1, where multiple warheads detonated nearly simultaneously. Detonation of high explosives produces peak overpressures ranging from 10 to 100 gigapascals at the detonation front, decreasing rapidly with distance. Within the confined volume of the torpedo room, the blast wave reflected from boundaries, creating complex interference patterns. Regions where incident and reflected waves superimposed experienced pressure multiplication. Even several meters from the detonation point, peak overpressures could reach tens or hundreds of megapascals, far exceeding any design case. The pressure hull and compartment I failed through multiple mechanisms simultaneously. Near the detonation centers, the steel experienced plastic flow permanent deformation beyond the elastic limit followed by tensile rupture. The hull plates literally tore apart under loading that exceeded the material's ultimate tensile strength. Further from the detonation, where peak pressures were lower but still substantial, welds failed through shear or tension. The failure propagated along weld seams as the blast loading exceeded the weld metal's strength or the heat-affected zone adjacent to welds, where thermal cycling during welding had altered the base metal's properties. Fracture mechanics provides insight into how cracks, once initiated, propagate through structures. A crack tip concentrates stress, and when the stress intensity at the tip exceeds the material's fracture toughness, the crack advances. Under high loading rates characteristic of explosive loading, cracks can propagate at velocities approaching 40% of the material's sound speed, roughly 2,000 meters per second for steel. A crack initiated at a weld-in compartment I could propagate several meters in milliseconds, branching and bifurcating as it encountered obstacles or changes in stress state. The outer hull, constructed from 8mm steel plate with 80mm of rubber coating, provided negligible resistance to internal blast loading. The thin plate ruptured easily under overpressure transmitted through the space between hulls. The rubber coating, designed for acoustic dampening, offered no structural contribution. Fragments of outer hull, rubber, piping, and equipment between the hulls were ejected outward and forward, creating the debris field that investigators later documented on the seabed forward of the submarine. Compartment 2, separated from Compartment I by a pressure-rated bulkhead, experienced blast loading transmitted through several pathways. The most direct path was through the bulkhead itself. Designed to resist hydrostatic pressure differential on the order of 1 megapascal, the bulkhead experienced loading perhaps 2 orders of magnitude higher. Bulkhead design includes stiffening frames and penetrations for cables, piping, and access hatches. Each penetration constitutes a potential failure point where stress concentrates. Under extreme overpressure, the bulkhead could deform, allowing pressure transmission even without complete rupture. Cable and pipe penetrations through the bulkhead provided bypass paths for blast wave propagation. Cables passed through glands designed for electromagnetic shielding and water tightness, not blast resistance. When the blast wave struck the compartment I side of the bulkhead, high-velocity gas flow accelerated through any available pathway. Cable glands, even if mechanically intact, could not prevent gas from traveling through the spaces between individual conductors within a cable bundle. Pressure waves propagating through these paths emerged into Compartment 2, creating localized overpressure that damaged equipment and created hazardous conditions for personnel. Ventilation ducting connected compartments to provide air circulation and climate control. Dampers at bulkhead penetrations could close to isolate compartments during fire or flooding, but damper response time measured in seconds far too slow to respond to blast waves with millisecond duration. Moreover, dampers designed to block airflow at near-atmospheric pressure differentials could not withstand megapascal-scale overpressure. The blast wave destroyed or bypassed dampers, propagating through ventilation systems into adjacent compartments. The cumulative effect of direct bulkhead loading, penetration bypass, and ventilation system propagation meant that Compartment 2 experienced substantial blast overpressure. Though attenuated compared to Compartment I, personnel in this space would have been subjected to peak overpressure sufficient to cause barotrauma lung hemorrhage, eardrum rupture, and internal. Compartment 3 crew quarters, radio room, and auxiliary equipment was separated from Compartment 2 by another bulkhead. The blast wave attenuation through 2 bulkheads and the increasing distance from detonation reduced peak overpressures to levels below those causing immediate structural failure. However, pressure waves still propagated through cable and ventilation penetrations. Instrumentation throughout Compartment 3 indicated catastrophic casualties forward, loss of all sensors and communication circuits from Compartments I and II, alarm systems activating simultaneously across multiple systems, and power distribution failures cascading through the electrical network. Personnel in Compartment 3, experiencing the violent shock and recognizing from training and the magnitude of the transient that a major explosion had occurred forward, initiated emergency response protocols. These included donning emergency breathing apparatus, activating backup lighting, attempting communication with other compartments via sound-powered phones, and preparing to seal bulkheads if flooding or fire propagated aft. The sound-powered phone attempts to Compartments I and II received no response, unsurprising given the destruction in those spaces. Fire propagation into Compartment 3 occurred through ventilation systems and cable runs, similar to the mechanism that brought fire from Compartment I into Compartment 2. The evidence recovered during later expeditions, including visual documentation of cut hull sections from Compartment 3, showed heat damage, soot deposits, and material degradation consistent with sustained fire exposure. The fire did not spread with the sudden intensity observed in Compartment 2, but developed progressively as ignition sources propagated through distributed fuel pathways. The decision facing personnel in Compartment 3, involved balancing the need to fight fire against the recognition that forward compartments were destroyed, and that survival probability increased by moving aft and sealing bulkheads. Firefighting in the confined space of a submarine compartment requires water or chemical suppression systems, functioning electrical power to operate pumps and ventilation to clear smoke, and multiple personnel coordinating efforts while wearing breathing apparatus. With forward compartments destroyed, power systems failing, and flooding likely to propagate AFT, attempting fire suppression in Compartment 3 risked trapping personnel in an increasingly untenable space. The rational decision, consistent with damage control doctrine, was to evacuate Compartment 3, seal the bulkhead separating it from Compartment 4, and consolidate further aft. This decision sacrificed the compartment and everything in it, but preserved personnel and maintained isolation between the fire zone and intact habitable spaces. The doctrine assumed that fire could not propagate through properly sealed bulkheads and that emergency equipment in aftmost compartments would sustain life until rescue arrived. Compartment 4, crew support spaces, and Compartment 5, auxiliary systems, remained structurally intact. The blast wave attenuation through multiple bulkheads and the distance from the explosion reduced loading to survivable levels. However, these compartments experienced loss of electrical temperature in Compartment 9 decreased over time as the submarine's hull equilibrated with seawater temperature. At 108 meters depth, seawater temperature ranged from 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. The submarine's internal climate control systems, now offline, no longer maintained 20-degree internal temperature. Heat conducted through the hull, through flooded equipment, and through ventilation systems. The crew's metabolic heat generation could not compensate for heat loss in a large metal enclosure surrounded by cold water. Hypothermia, core body temperature dropping below 35 degrees Celsius, produces impaired judgment, reduced physical capability, and eventually loss of consciousness and death if core temperature drops below 28 degrees. The combination of atmospheric toxicity, oxygen depletion, CO2 accumulation, cold exposure, and rising water level created a multi-hazard environment where survival time depended on which factor reached lethal threshold first. The crew's training and discipline in managing limited resources could extend survival time, but only within the bounds set by the physical consumables and environmental stressors. The reactor compartment throughout this period remained safely shut down with no threat of core damage or radiological release. The multiple barriers between the reactor fuel and the environment fuel cladding, reactor vessel, primary coolant boundary, containment structure all remained intact. Decay heat generation decreased exponentially over time following shutdown, reducing from approximately 10 megawatts immediately after shutdown to 3 megawatts after 1 hour, 1 megawatt after 10 hours, and progressively lower values thereafter. Natural circulation cooling could remove this heat without active pumping. Even in a flooded condition, the seawater surrounding the reactor compartment provided an enormous heat sink. The reactor posed no threat to crew survival and represented one of the few submarine systems that functioned exactly as designed through the entire casualty. The structural damage pattern, documented through later underwater surveys and recovery operations, confirmed the failure chain. Compartments I and II were destroyed, with hull structure fragmented and scattered as debris. Compartment 3 showed fire damage and structural deformation, but remained partially intact. Compartments 4 through 9 showed progressively less damage, with the aftmost compartment structurally sound. This pattern confirmed that the casualty originated in Compartment 1 and propagated aft, with damage severity decreasing with distance from the explosion center. The starboard crack observed on the outer hull, extending several meters aft from the forward destroyed section, indicated tensile failure of the outer hull under internal overpressure. The crack initiated near the detonation center and propagated aft along the weld seam or along a line of structural weakness created by the blast loading. This crack, combined with the massive breach in the forward pressure hull, allowed unrestricted flooding of the forward sections. The submarine's resting position on the seabed bow embedded in sediment at approximately 20 degrees nose down slight port list resulted from the asymmetric flooding pattern and the hydrodynamic forces during descent. The flooded bow was heavy. The intact aft sections retained buoyancy. During descent, The stern likely remained higher than the bow. Upon seabed impact, the bow penetrated soft sediment while the stern remained elevated. The final position reflected the balance between the weight distribution along the hull and the support provided by seabed contact. The failure chain was mechanistically deterministic from the moment the first torpedo ruptured. Each subsequent step sympathetic detonation of adjacent weapons, structural failure propagating through compartments, flooding of breached spaces, descent and seabed impact followed from the physical properties of materials, the energy balance of explosive reactions, and the structural architecture of the vessel. No intervention point existed where crew action could have altered the outcome once the second explosion occurred. The physical timescale was milliseconds to seconds. Human perception and response timescale was seconds to minutes. By the time personnel recognized something had occurred, the decisive events had already concluded. The question remaining was whether the systems designed to preserve crew survival after such a casualty compartmentation, life support, rescue capability, could function within their own design margins, or whether they too contained assumptions about operational conditions that had diverged from reality. The emergency life support systems in Compartment 9 were designed for a specific scenario, provide breathable atmosphere, temperature tolerance, and basic survival necessities for a defined crew size over a defined time period while awaiting external rescue. The design assumptions embedded in this system were explicit: rescue assets existed, had adequate capability to reach the submarine's maximum operating depth, could respond within hours to days, and could either extract survivors or provide external life support until recovery operations succeeded. Each assumption rested on institutional infrastructure, resource availability, and operational doctrine that, like the weapons systems maintenance infrastructure, had suffered from post-Soviet resource constraints. Compartment 9 occupied approximately 15 meters of the submarine's aftmost section. The usable volume, after accounting for propulsion motors, electrical equipment, piping, cable runs, and stored materials, provided roughly 200 cubic meters of habitable space. At standard atmospheric conditions, this volume contained approximately 40 kilograms of oxygen sufficient for one person for 20 to 30 days under resting metabolic rates, or for 20 people for 1 to 2 days. The 23 personnel who had consolidated in the compartment, as documented in Kolesnikov's note, consumed oxygen at a collective rate of approximately 400 liters per hour at rest, faster if physical exertion or stress elevated metabolic rates. Carbon dioxide production paralleled oxygen consumption. Each person exhaled approximately 20 liters of carbon dioxide per hour. The atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration, initially near 400 parts per million, 0.04%, would rise steadily in a sealed environment. At 1% CO2, breathing rate increases noticeably. At 3%, cognitive impairment begins. At 5%, severe respiratory distress occurs. At 10%, loss of consciousness can occur within minutes. The time to reach hazardous carbon dioxide levels depends on the air volume and the number of people breathing. For 23 people in 200 cubic meters, carbon dioxide would reach 1% within approximately 4 hours, 3% within 12 hours, absent any removal mechanism. The compartment's emergency life support systems included chemical CO, 2 scrubbers using lithium hydroxide or equivalent absorbent materials. These scrubbers operated passively. The crew positioned the canisters where air circulation driven by thermal convection or by manually operated fans would expose the breathing atmosphere to the chemical absorbent. Lithium hydroxide reacts with carbon dioxide to form lithium carbonate, removing carbon dioxide from the air. The scrubber capacity depends on the mass of absorbent material and its reactivity. A typical submarine escape compartment might carry enough scrubber capacity for 20 people for 24 to 72 hours. However, scrubber effectiveness depends on several factors that deteriorated under the Kursk's actual conditions. The absorbent must remain dry to function efficiently. Water contamination degrades reactivity. Air must circulate through the scrubber. Stagnant pockets allow carbon dioxide accumulation in local zones. Temperature affects reaction kinetics. Cold conditions slow carbon dioxide absorption. As water flooded into Compartment 9, the rising water level submerged equipment, including potentially some scrubber canisters, Humidity increased, degrading absorbent efficiency. Air circulation became difficult as the available dry volume contracted. Emergency oxygen generation systems provided a means to replenish consumed oxygen. These systems typically employed chemical oxygen generators devices containing sodium chlorate or similar compounds that, when activated, undergo exothermic decomposition to release oxygen gas. Each generator produced a fixed quantity of oxygen over a period of minutes to hours, generating substantial heat as a byproduct. The heat, while beneficial in a cold environment, posed fire risk if the generator contacted combustible materials or if oxygen-enriched atmosphere surrounded ignition sources. The compartment's oxygen generator inventory, sized for the design basis crew capacity and expected survival duration, might provide several days' worth of oxygen for 20 to 25 personnel, if all generators were available and functional. However, activating generators carried risks. The heat generated could raise atmospheric temperature uncomfortably or even hazardously in a confined space. More critically, increasing oxygen concentration above the normal 21% accelerates combustion processes. Materials that barely support combustion in normal air burn vigorously in oxygen-enriched atmosphere. If fire debris, damaged electrical insulation, or combustible materials existed in the compartment, operating oxygen generators could inadvertently create fire hazards. The crew's decision-making regarding life support resource management involved balancing multiple competing factors. Activating too few oxygen generators risked hypoxia, insufficient oxygen to support consciousness and life. Activating too many risked oxygen toxicity, relevant only at concentrations above 50%, fire hazard, and exhausting the oxygen supply faster than rescue could arrive. Running scrubbers continuously maximized CO2 removal, but exhausted absorbent capacity faster. Conserving scrubbers allowed atmospheric CO2 to rise, impairing mental function and making subsequent scrubber deployment less effective. The Kolesnikov note indicated that the crew was managing these resources, but the note also indicated water rising in the compartment. This flooding, though slow, represented a failure mode that life support systems could not address. Each cubic meter of water that entered the compartment displaced 1 cubic meter of air, approximately 1.3 kilograms of oxygen lost. As the water rose, the effective atmospheric volume decreased, accelerating the rate of oxygen depletion and CO2 accumulation per unit of remaining air volume. The water source likely came from progressive leakage through damaged penetrations, piping systems, or structural cracks that developed under the combined effects of blast damage, impact shock, and hydrostatic pressure. At 108 meters depth, 1.1 megapascals of pressure drove water through any available pathway. Even microcracks or imperfect seal seats could allow water flow measured in liters per minute. Over hours, such flows could introduce hundreds of liters of water into the compartment, sufficient to submerge floor-level equipment and create an increasingly hazardous environment. The water temperature, approximately 3 degrees Celsius, accelerated heat loss from personnel in contact with it. Wet clothing conducts heat away from the body far more effectively than dry clothing. Submersion in cold water, even if only legs and feet, dramatically increases thermal conductivity from the body core to the environment. Hypothermia onset depends on water temperature, body insulation, clothing, fat layer, and the percentage of body surface area submerged. In 3-degree water, hypothermia can develop within 1 to 2 hours for immersed individuals, faster for those with less insulation or greater exposed surface area. The crew would have attempted to minimize water contact by positioning themselves on elevated platforms, bunks, or equipment, where the rising water had not yet reached. As water continued rising, the available dry space decreased, forcing personnel into increasingly crowded conditions in the uppermost portion of the compartment. Crowding has both positive and negative survival effects. Personnel can share body heat, reducing individual heat loss, but crowding also increases local atmospheric degradation rates and limits ability to perform physical tasks like managing life support equipment. Psychological stress under such conditions is substantial and unavoidable. The crew knew they were trapped, that flooding was occurring, that life support resources were finite, and that their survival depended entirely on external rescue arriving before conditions became lethal. Stress increases metabolic rate, which increases oxygen consumption and CO2 production, which accelerates the rate of atmospheric degradation. Stress also impairs judgment, making optimal resource management decisions more difficult. Training provides some resilience, establishing conditioned responses that function under stress, but no training fully prepares individuals for the reality of awaiting death in a progressively flooding compartment. The external rescue response, which should have begun within hours of the explosion, was delayed by multiple factors. The first factor was simply recognition that a casualty had occurred. The seismic events were detected by Norwegian and other international monitoring systems within minutes. But this information required interpretation, correlation with submarine operating areas, and communication to Russian naval authorities. The delay in recognizing that the Kursk was missing and that the seismic events corresponded to its last known position consumed many hours. The emergency ascent buoy, designed to automatically release upon casualty and float to the surface with radio, beacon, and communication equipment, failed to deploy. The mechanism relied on electrical signals triggered by specific sensor readings, flooding detectors, shock sensors, loss of propulsion indications integrated through logic circuits. The blast damage disrupted these circuits, or the sensor threshold settings did not recognize the casualty condition, or the release mechanism jammed. Without the buoy, surface vessels had no immediate indication that the Kursk was in distress. Exercise controllers initially assumed radio silence resulted from routine operational procedures rather than casualty. When Russian naval authorities recognized that the Kursk was missing, initial search efforts focused on locating the submarine. The exercise area covered hundreds of square kilometers. Acoustic detection of the submarine's position required deploying sonar-equipped vessels or underwater sensors, analyzing acoustic returns and correlating them with known seabed features. The Barents Sea seabed at 108 meters depth is relatively flat but not featureless. Distinguishing a submarine hull from natural bottom features requires close-range inspection. Surface weather conditions during the initial search period included moderate to rough seas, complicating small vessel operations and helicopter deployment. While not severe storms, the sea state made rescue submersible launch and recovery operations more difficult and hazardous. Weather imposed constraints on how quickly rescue assets could reach the site and how effectively they could conduct operations once there. The Russian Northern Fleet's primary rescue assets were AS-class rescue submersibles, small submarines designed to dock with disabled vessels' rescue hatches, equalize pressure, open the hatch, and transfer personnel to the rescue vehicle. The AS-28 and AS-34 were the relevant assets. These submersibles had depth ratings adequate for the Kursk's depth, but their operational readiness, crew training currency, and mechanical condition had suffered from the same resource constraints affecting all fleet systems. The rescue submersibles required launch from surface support ships, equipped with handling cranes and deployment systems. These ships needed to transit from their home ports to the accident site, a voyage measured in hours to a full day depending on starting location. Upon arrival, conditions had to permit safe submersible launch, wind and sea state within limits, surface vessel maintaining position over the target, coordination between ship crew and submersible operators. Each constraint introduced potential delays. On August 16, 4 days after the explosion, AS-34 attempted to dock with the Kursk's aft rescue hatch. In compartment 9th, the submersible located the submarine on the seabed and maneuvered to position the docking collar over the hatch. However, achieving a pressure-tight seal proved impossible. Several factors contributed to the difficulty. The submarine rested at approximately 20 degrees bow-down angle and listed slightly to port. This angle meant the rescue hatch was not vertical, complicating the docking geometry. The docking collar on the rescue submersible required alignment within tight tolerances to achieve seal integrity. Debris around the hatch sediment disturbed during impact, rubber coating fragments, or damage from the casualty may have prevented the collar from seating flush against the mating surface. The hatch itself might have been deformed by blast overpressure or impact shock, altering its geometry enough to prevent proper seal. The rescue submersible's limited maneuvering capability and visibility in turbid bottom water made precise positioning difficult, after multiple attempts over several hours, as 34% surfaced without achieving a successful seal. By August 17 to 18, Russian authorities accepted international offers of assistance. Norway, the United Kingdom, and the United States offered advanced rescue capabilities, including saturation diving systems and remotely operated vehicles with greater manipulation capability than the Russian assets. British LR-5 rescue submarine and Norwegian commercial diving support vessel Seaway Eagle were mobilized. However, transit time to the site from their home locations consumed additional days. When Norwegian divers from Seaway Eagle reached the site and descended to the submarine on August 21, they manually opened the outer rescue hatch in compartment 9th. The hatch, designed to open from inside or outside, required significant force to unseal after days under pressure and potential corrosion. Once opened, water filled the rescue trunk, the shaft connecting the external hatch to the internal hatch. The divers then opened the inner hatch, which gave access to the compartment interior. The compartment was flooded completely. No air pocket remained. The water inside the compartment was at ambient seawater temperature, approximately 3 degrees Celsius. Visibility was near zero due to suspended sediment and debris. The divers, using waterproof video cameras and powerful lights, documented what they could observe. They found no survivors. The recovery of casualties occurred later, during October 2000 operations when access holes were cut through the hull to allow entry and systematic search. The timeline between the explosion at 7:28 GMT on August 12 and the opening of the rescue hatch on August 21 exceeded 9 days, 216 hours. The Kolesnikov note, written at least 4 to 6 hours post-casualty, indicated the crew was alive at that time. Forensic analysis of casualty remains and compartment conditions suggested that death occurred within approximately 8 to 24 hours post-casualty, depending on which factors reached lethal thresholds first. The crew survived long enough to write coherent notes, manage life support equipment, and await rescue, but not long enough for rescue to arrive. The divergence between designed survival endurance and actual survival time involved multiple degrading factors. The flooding reduced atmospheric volume faster than design basis assumed. The fire contamination of atmosphere introduced toxics not accounted for in scrubber capacity. The cold water accelerated hypothermia beyond the thermal environment design assumption. The stress and potential injuries increased metabolic oxygen consumption above resting baseline. Each factor individually might have been survivable. The combination overwhelmed the safety margins. The rescue system design assumptions proved as vulnerable as the weapons system design assumptions. Both assumed operational conditions, maintenance quality, resource availability, rapid response, equipment functionality that had eroded in the post-Soviet resource environment. The weapons system assumption failed catastrophically at 7:28 on August 12. The rescue system assumption failed progressively over the following hours and days, exhausting the crew's survival endurance before external assistance could bridge the gap. Secondary crises emerged in the form of institutional and diplomatic challenges. The Russian government's initial reluctance to accept international assistance consumed 4 to 6 days of the limited survival window. The reasons included concern about foreign access to classified submarine technology, reluctance to acknowledge the casualty publicly, institutional pride, and complex decision-making chains in a crisis involving military assets and international relations. Each day of delay made survival less likely and recovery more certain to involve casualty recovery rather than rescue. When international assets finally received permission to assist and arrived on site, the divers and engineers discovered that the technical challenges, achieving docking seal, opening hatches, verifying compartment conditions, were compounded by the simple fact that too much time had elapsed. The compartment was flooded, atmosphere exhausted, and personnel deceased. The international assistance succeeded in the technical task of opening the submarine and beginning casualty recovery, but failed in the fundamental objective of saving lives because the rescue timeline exceeded survival endurance. The stabilization attempts, both by the trapped crew managing life support and by external rescue forces attempting to reach them, illustrate how crisis management depends not only on capability and intent, but on matching timelines. The crew did everything within their capability to extend survival time. External rescue forces deployed assets and attempted intervention. The gap between survival endurance and rescue response time, just hours or tens of hours, proved unbridgeable given the operational realities of the systems involved. The note found with Lieutenant Captain Kolesnikov's body ended with a message to his family, and an expression that he and his colleagues hoped for rescue, but understood their situation was dire. The note provides documentary evidence that the crew maintained mental clarity and discipline for hours after the casualty, contradicting any suggestion that death was instantaneous or that the crew panicked. They functioned rationally within constraints that made survival improbable but not yet impossible. The failure was not human error in the aft compartments. It was systemic failure to provide survival endurance margins compatible with achievable rescue response times. The reactor compartment, throughout this period, continued to cool safely with no indication of any abnormal condition. The passive safety features natural circulation cooling, decay heat decrease over time. Multiple barriers between fuel and environment functioned without requiring operator intervention or external support. Seawater flooding the reactor compartment posed no threat to core integrity. The steel reactor vessel, designed for far higher pressures and temperatures than the flooded environment imposed, maintained structural integrity. The primary coolant boundary, isolated from the external environment by the reactor vessel and containment, remained sealed. No pathway existed for fission products or fuel material to escape to the environment. This contrast reactor systems functioning perfectly while life support systems failed reflected different design philosophies and resource allocation. Reactor safety received continued attention, funding, and design conservatism because reactor accidents posed catastrophic radiological consequences. Life support and rescue systems, while important, competed for resources with other operational priorities and suffered when budgets contracted. The result, the most feared consequence, radiological release, did not occur, while a consequence considered less probable and more manageable, crew survival awaiting rescue, proved fatal. The forensic investigation began with underwater surveys conducted by remotely operated vehicles in August 2000, within 2 weeks of the explosion. The Norwegian diving vessel Seaway Eagle deployed ROVs equipped with video cameras, sonar mapping systems, and radiation detection instruments. The primary objectives were to assess radiological safety, document external damage, determine if rescue remained possible, and if not, plan for casualty recovery operations. The imagery and data collected provided the first objective documentation of the submarine's condition independent of institutional filtering or interpretation. The forward section damage was catastrophic and immediately apparent. Approximately 18 meters of the bow, encompassing compartments I and II and part of compartment 3, showed complete structural disintegration. The pressure hull was breached in multiple locations with jagged edges characteristic of internal explosive overpressure. The outer hull had fragmented into debris scattered across the seabed forward of the submarine. Torpedo components, including propulsion sections, guidance systems, and fragmented casing materials, littered the debris field. The distribution pattern, concentrated near the submarine with decreasing density extending forward and to the sides, confirmed internal origin rather than external impact. Video documentation showed that the pressure hull rupture exhibited outward deformation. The steel plating bent outward from internal pressure, with fracture surfaces indicating tensile failure. This observation was critical to ruling out external attack scenarios. Torpedo impact from outside would produce inward deformation with compression failure characteristics. Mine detonation below the hull would create upward deformation. The observed damage geometry was consistent only with internal explosion driving pressure outward through the hull. The starboard side crack, extending aft from the destroyed bow section, measured several meters in length and followed weld seams or lines of structural weakness. Material analysis of recovered hull sections later confirmed tensile overload failure. The steel exceeded its ultimate tensile strength under loading and tore apart. The crack edges showed clean fracture surfaces without corrosion or pre-existing crack growth, indicating sudden failure under extreme load rather than progressive fatigue cracking. recovered torpedo fragments underwent chemical and metallurgical analysis. Residues on internal surfaces of propellant compartment sections showed evidence consistent with hydrogen peroxide decomposition, oxidation products, elevated oxygen content in trapped gas pockets, and chemical signatures matching peroxide breakdown products rather than conventional explosive residues. The analysis detected no traces of RDX, TNT, or other common military explosives at locations where initial decomposition occurred, confirming that the initiating event was chemical decomposition of the torpedo propellant, not warhead detonation. The presence of conventional explosive residues in the debris field was expected and confirmed multiple warheads had detonated during the second explosion. However, the spatial distribution and chemical signature differentiated between initiating cause, peroxide decomposition, and propagated consequence, warhead detonation. The forensic chemical analysis closed the question of causation. High-test peroxide torpedo failure initiated the cascade that led to warhead detonations. Material samples from torpedo valve assemblies and seal components showed degradation consistent with extended service and inadequate maintenance. Elastomer seals exhibited hardening, loss of elasticity, and micro-cracking observable under microscopic examination. The passivation layers on aluminum alloy surfaces showed localized breakdown, exposing reactive metal to propellant contact. Contamination was present in the form of metallic particles, likely iron or copper from corroded fittings, and organic residues of indeterminate origin, possibly degraded seal material, cleaning solvent residues, or lubricants. Each contaminant type is known to catalyze hydrogen peroxide decomposition. The concentration and distribution of contamination within recovered torpedo sections could not be determined precisely because the explosion and subsequent seawater exposure altered the evidence. However, the presence of catalytically active materials in contact with propellant storage volumes confirmed that the necessary conditions for decomposition initiation existed. Combined with the chemical signature of peroxide decomposition products, this evidence established the failure mechanism beyond reasonable doubt. Compartment 3 hull sections, recovered during October 2000 operations when cutting access holes allowed interior inspection, showed extensive fire damage, soot deposits, heat-affected metal surfaces, and melted or degraded cable insulation confirmed sustained fire exposure. The fire pattern indicated ignition sources distributed throughout the compartment, consistent with electrical arcing from blast-damaged wiring and fuel provided by cable insulation running throughout the space. The atmosphere in Compartment 3 during the fire would have been immediately dangerous to life, explaining why personnel evacuated aft rather than attempting fire suppression. Compartment 4 sections showed minimal structural damage but substantial equipment damage from shock loading. Instrumentation racks, electrical panels, and piping systems exhibited impact damage and deformation. However, the pressure hull and bulkheads remained intact, confirming that structural failure was confined to the forward sections directly exposed to blast overpressure. The compartmentation architecture had performed its intended function to the extent possible. Damage did not propagate structurally beyond the immediate blast zone. The reactor compartment inspections, conducted with particular attention to radiological safety, confirmed that both reactors remained safely shut down with intact primary boundaries. Water sampling around the reactor compartment detected no fission products or fuel material above background levels. Gamma radiation surveys of the external hull surfaces near the reactor compartment showed readings consistent with activated metal in the reactor structure, an expected consequence of normal operation, but no indication of fuel damage or coolant boundary breach. Sediment samples from the seabed adjacent to the submarine similarly showed no radioactive contamination above natural background and fallout from historical atmospheric nuclear testing. The radiological safety assessment concluded that the reactor systems posed no immediate threat and that long-term risk depended primarily on corrosion timescales for the multiple barriers containing the fuel. Steel reactor vessels in cold seawater corrode at predictable rates measurable in millimeters per year. The vessel walls, tens of centimeters thick, would require decades to centuries to corrode through. Fuel cladding, if breached by corrosion, would release fission products into the primary coolant, but the coolant boundary itself, the reactor vessel and primary piping, would contain those releases unless also breached. The assessment estimated that significant radiological release, if it occurred at all, would be measured in decades to centuries, not years. This finding had important policy implications. Immediate recovery of the submarine was not necessary for radiological safety. However, the submarine contained 2 nuclear reactors, potentially nuclear warheads on cruise missiles, conventional explosives, and represented both an environmental concern and a navigation hazard. The decision about whether to raise the submarine, seal it in place, or monitor for future developments involved political, economic, environmental, and technical considerations beyond the scope of immediate forensic investigation. Casualty remains recovered during October 2000 operations provided medical forensic evidence about survival time and cause of death. 12 bodies were recovered from compartments 8 and 9 during that expedition. The remains, having been submerged in cold seawater for 2 months, showed advanced decomposition, but forensic pathology analysis could still determine certain facts. Trauma patterns indicated that aftee personnel did not die from blast injuries. No evidence of pressure trauma, fragmentation wounds, or burn injuries. This confirmed they survived the initial explosion and died subsequently from environmental factors. Toxicology analysis, though complicated by decomposition and seawater exposure, suggested carbon monoxide and possibly hydrogen cyanide exposure consistent with smoke and toxic gas inhalation from fire in forward compartments migrating aft. Hypothermia as a contributing factor was inferred from circumstantial evidence. The cold water flooding compartment 9, wet clothing observed on remains, and the known timeline extending many hours. The combination toxic atmosphere, oxygen depletion, cold exposure, and eventual drowning as water rose indicated death occurred through progressive environmental failure rather than acute trauma. The note found with Lieutenant Captain Kolesnikov's body, already discussed, provided the most direct evidence of crew thought processes and timeline. The note was written on standard paper in blue ink, folded, and apparently kept in a waterproof pocket or container. The handwriting was clear and controlled, indicating the author was mentally coherent when writing. The content was factual rather than emotional. Names, compartment location, brief casualty description, timestamp, and closing message to family. This composure under extreme stress reflected training, discipline, and the professionalism expected of submarine officers. The note's timestamp indicating it was written hours after the explosion proved that the crew survived well into the afternoon of August 12, possibly into the evening. Combined with forensic estimates of death timing based on physiological and environmental factors, the evidence suggested survival duration between 8 and 24 hours post-casualty. This range encompasses the time required for atmospheric carbon dioxide to reach lethal levels, for hypothermia to progress from onset to fatal core temperature depression, or for flooding to submerge the last dry pockets, forcing submersion and drowning. The forensic timeline, integrating seismic data, physical damage documentation, chemical analysis, and medical evidence, reconstructed the event sequence with high confidence. 7:28:27 GMT, first explosion, 1.5 Richter, single torpedo propellant compartment rupture, 7:28:27 to 7:30:42, cascade through multiple torpedoes, thermal propagation, pressure buildup 7:30:42. GMT, second explosion, 3.5 Richter, multiple warhead detonations, 7:30:42 to 7:35. Structural failure, flooding, descent, seabed impact 7:35 to 12, crew consolidation in AFT compartments, life support activation 12 to 24+, progressive atmospheric degradation, flooding, hypothermia, death. This timeline eliminated alternative causation hypotheses. External torpedo attack would produce a single explosion with inward hull deformation. Collision would produce structural damage without explosion or with single impact signature. Sabotage would require access to weapons systems and would not produce the two-stage signature with precisely 135-second separation. The only scenario consistent with all evidence was internal torpedo propellant decomposition, initiating cascade failure through adjacent weapons. The Russian governmental commission investigating the accident reached similar conclusions in its official report, released in summary form in 2001. The commission determined that the accident resulted from explosion of a torpedo in the torpedo compartment caused by destabilization of hydrogen peroxide in the torpedo propellant system. The report identified contributing factors including material condition of weapon systems and maintenance resource constraints, but stopped short of attributing blame to specific individuals or systemic institutional failures. The report's conclusions aligned with physical evidence but avoided detailed institutional analysis that might assign responsibility. Norwegian authorities, conducting parallel assessment through the joint Norwegian-Russian expert group on radioactive contamination in northern areas, published independent findings consistent with the Russian conclusions on physical causation while emphasizing environmental monitoring recommendations. The Norwegian report noted that radiological risk remained low but recommended continued surveillance to detect any future releases. International expert groups, including NATO assessments, similarly concluded that hydrogen peroxide torpedo failure initiated the casualty, marking this as the most probable cause with high confidence. The systemic lessons derived from the Kursk disaster extended beyond the immediate causation to address the underlying conditions that made the failure inevitable. The first lesson concerned technology integration. Performance-optimized systems that trade stability for capability require operational environments matching design assumptions. High-test peroxide torpedoes were not inherently unsafe, but they required contamination control, maintenance quality, and inspection rigor that post-Soviet resource constraints could not reliably provide. When operational reality diverged from design assumptions, the safety margin collapsed invisibly until conditions aligned to trigger failure. The second lesson addressed inspection and certification protocols. Visual inspection and static testing cannot detect all hazardous conditions in chemically reactive systems. Subsurface contamination, microscale seal degradation, and passivation layer breakdown occur below the detection threshold of routine inspection methods. Protocols optimized for operational availability rather than conservative risk assessment allow marginal conditions to accumulate fleet-wide. Certification that a weapon meets standards does not guarantee the weapon possesses adequate safety margin when those standards have eroded relative to physical requirements. The third lesson concerned human factors and organizational culture. Normalization of deviance. The progressive acceptance of degraded conditions as normal through repeated non-failure operates invisibly through rational local decisions under resource constraints. No individual inspection decision appeared negligent. No single maintenance deferral caused the failure. The cumulative effect of many small adaptations to scarcity created systemic vulnerability. Organizational safety culture requires institutional processes that detect and correct this drift before it exhausts safety margins. The fourth lesson involved rescue capability and survival system design. Emergency life support systems are effective only when survival endurance exceeds rescue response time. The Kursk's aft compartments provided temporary refuge, but temporary assumed a rescue timeline incompatible with actual operational readiness of rescue assets. Compartmentation successfully isolated survivors from immediate destruction, but isolation without autonomous long-duration life support created a different failure mode, death from environmental degradation before rescue arrival. The fifth lesson addressed information flow and decision-making in crisis. The delayed recognition of casualty, the failure of automatic alerting systems, the reluctance to accept international assistance, and the communication gaps between technical assessment and policy decision all consumed survival time. Crisis management under uncertainty requires pre-established protocols, clear authority, and willingness to accept help despite concerns about operational security or institutional pride. Each day of delay made rescue impossible and recovery certain. The sixth lesson, perhaps most fundamental, concerned the structural inevitability of system failures when design assumptions diverge from operational reality. The Kursk disaster was not attributable to individual negligence, procedural violation, or unpredictable failure. It resulted from the accumulated effect of institutional resource constraints degrading the operational environment below the level assumed during system design. Every component functioned as designed. Every procedure was followed as written. The failure emerged from the gap between design assumptions and operational conditions, a gap that widened over years without triggering alarms because the warning signals were interpreted as acceptable variations rather than margin erosion. In the aftermath, the Russian Navy removed all high-test peroxide torpedoes from service, replacing them with conventional battery-electric weapons. This decision eliminated the specific hazard that destroyed the Kursk but did not address the underlying systemic conditions, budget constraints, maintenance challenges, training gaps, organizational pressures that enabled the failure. Those conditions persist and affect other systems across the fleet. The broader lesson is that technology optimization creates dependencies. When those dependencies cannot be maintained, reverting to less optimized but more robust alternatives may improve system-level safety, despite reducing component-level performance. Rescue capability received increased attention and investment following the disaster. International cooperation agreements established frameworks for rapid response and mutual assistance in submarine casualties. Rescue submersible readiness improved through increased training and maintenance priority. However, the fundamental challenge remains: submarine operating depth limits versus rescue system capability. The Kursk, at 108 meters, was within reach of available rescue systems. Submarines operating at 300 to 600 meters depth exceed the capability of most rescue systems. The deeper the disabled submarine, the more complex and time-consuming rescue operations become, and the more critical survival endurance margins become. The Kursk's hull remained on the seabed for nearly a year after the casualty. In October 2001, a commercial salvage operation successfully raised the submarine by cutting away the destroyed bow section, sealing the resulting opening, and using pontoons to lift the aft sections. The operation, funded by the Russian government and executed by Dutch and Norwegian salvage firms, recovered the submarine to allow detailed forensic examination, casualty recovery, and elimination of the navigation hazard. The recovered hull sections confirmed all prior assessments and provided no new information that altered conclusions about causation. The weapon systems recovered from the salvaged hull sections underwent detailed analysis. The findings reinforced the contamination and degradation mechanisms identified in earlier investigations. Some weapons showed visible corrosion and seal deterioration that should have triggered rejection during inspection. The fact that they had passed certification indicated that acceptance criteria were insufficiently conservative, or that inspection execution was cursory. This finding supported the conclusion that systemic conditions, not isolated component failures, created the vulnerability. The reactor compartment, inspected after raising, confirmed that both reactors remained safely shut down with intact fuel. The reactors were eventually defueled, and the submarine dismantled for scrap, eliminating the long-term radiological concern. The operation demonstrated that reactor safety systems, designed with extreme conservatism and multiple redundant barriers, had performed exactly as intended despite circumstances far beyond any anticipated accident scenario. The human cost 118 deaths, including experienced officers and crew representing substantial training investment, made the Kursk disaster the worst submarine casualty since World War II. The families of the deceased, the broader Russian public, and international observers demanded accountability and assurance that lessons had been learned. The governmental and naval responses included enhanced safety reviews, increased training emphasis on casualty procedures, improved maintenance funding for critical systems, and strengthened international cooperation on submarine safety. However, assessing whether these responses addressed root causes or merely surface symptoms requires examining whether institutional resource allocation, organizational culture, and system design philosophy changed fundamentally, or whether adaptations focused on the specific failure mode without addressing the underlying structural conditions. The evidence suggests that some improvements occurred, particularly in rescue capability and international cooperation, but that broader systemic challenges persist. Budget constraints remain. Maintenance resource allocation competes with operational demands. Inspection protocols balance safety conservatism against availability requirements. The institutional context that shaped decisions leading to the Kursk disaster continues to shape decisions today, albeit with increased awareness of the risks. The Kursk disaster stands as a case study in how complex systems fail when operational conditions diverge from design assumptions. The failure was not sudden or unpredictable, but rather the inevitable outcome of accumulated latent conditions that eroded safety margins invisibly over time. The system appeared functional from internal perspectives, procedures followed, standards met, operations continuing, while physical and institutional conditions drifted toward a state where failure became statistically probable given sufficient time and fleet exposure. The forensic evidence removed uncertainty about causation, contaminated hydrogen peroxide torpedoes initiated cascading failure through chemical decomposition, structural rupture, and sympathetic detonation. The institutional analysis revealed how resource constraints, inspection limitations, maintenance degradation, and organizational pressures created the conditions enabling that failure. The outcome, 118 deaths and total submarine loss, resulted not from error or malice, but from systemic mismatch between designed safety margins and operational reality. The question posed at the beginning remains, how can a weapons system designed to provide tactical advantage become the mechanism through which design validation assumptions prove incompatible with operational constraints? The answer, confirmed through forensic investigation and systemic analysis, is that safety margins exist not in hardware alone, but in the complete system of hardware, procedures, training, institutional support, economic resources, and operational tempo. When any element degrades below the design assumption, margins erode. When multiple elements degrade simultaneously across years, the erosion becomes fleet-wide. At that point, failure is no longer a question of whether but when, no longer preventable by operators because the conditions that enable it were established long before through decisions made far from the operational level. The Kursk disaster is not a story about negligence, sabotage, or unpredictable catastrophe. It is a documented case of systemic failure emerging from the interaction between optimized technology, eroded infrastructure, and institutional constraints. The lesson is not specific to Russian submarines or high-test peroxide torpedoes. It applies to any complex system where performance optimization creates dependencies that must be sustained through active institutional effort. When those dependencies cannot be maintained through budget constraints, institutional change, or evolving operational demands, the system contains the failure already, latent and invisible, waiting for conditions to align.